All right, so in this lecture, we're going to be discussing Chapter 11, which is called The Second Half of Life. It's discussing issues for women as they approach midlife and as they move on into older ages. So we're going to be talking about things like the social meanings of age, images of older women, and then we'll talk more about physical changes and relationship changes and work changes in part 2 or the second lecture on this chapter. So let's talk about what we mean by not just the number, the social meaning of age. So this can be all sorts of things, okay, when we talk about social meanings of age, okay? Because age is very subjective. Its meaning is defined by basically by social consensus. So it's very culturally defined. Generally, in our culture, midlife is considered from about age 45 to about age 65. Old age is considered beyond 65, although 65 is getting younger all the time in our culture because people are living longer and longer. When we talk about people being born in the same decade, we're talking about, for instance, things like people born in the 1990s. That would be people born in the same decade. Or like my kids were all born in the first decade of the year 2000s. So they were all born between 2000 and 2010. If we look at social meanings of age, we'll see that people experience aging differently depending on their own individual differences, their social class, their age cohort, whether they're male or female. There's different experiences of aging, and obviously that's a lot of what we'll be looking at. So let's work our way through these different things. Age in years, interestingly enough, is only loosely correlated with abilities and roles. So, for example, one man at 70 might be the president, while another man at 70 might be in a nursing home, right, and incapacitated. So there's a large range of abilities and roles at different ages. Okay. We do know some things very clearly different for men and women in terms of aging. There's very much a double standard of aging, and this is the belief that women are old at a much earlier age than men are, okay? So you see this everywhere. You see this in the media, where a woman in her 40s is portrayed as old, whereas a man in his 40s is just coming into his prime, okay? So that's an example of the double standard of aging, okay? Women in general are rated more negatively on their physical characteristics of aging. That means that the ratings of men and women's physical attractiveness doesn't decline at similar rates. Rather, women's physical attractiveness goes down. Ratings of their physical attractive goes down much earlier than men. So women are considered no longer physically attractive at a younger age than men are, which plays right into what you see from that, where like men in our culture tend to marry younger women, not generally speaking, women marrying younger men. Okay. So women in general are rated more negatively on physical characteristics of age, okay? And women are considered old when they can no longer attract men or reproduce, whereas a man is not considered old until he becomes mentally or physically incapacitated, right? So again, that whole notion that men are considered old at a much later age than women. If you look at research on sexual attractiveness and aging, you see this as well, that there's differences in terms of aging, and sexually attractive women are much younger than sexually attractive men. Sexually attractive men are men who can be on up into their 40s, 50s, and 60s. Not so much for women. Okay. So when we think about prejudice and discrimination based on age, that's termed ageism, okay? Ageism is a very real thing. In a meta-analysis of 232 studies, the overall preference was for younger people, more attractive, more competent, were considered much more preferable. So ageism is real. Prejudice and discrimination and a lack of favorability occur based on age. Okay. Now, older people may turn this discrimination, this ageism, inward and internalize it and develop negative and self-defeating beliefs and attitudes that can contribute to depression and other dysfunction later in life. And if you'll see this in the research, for instance, women are more concerned about changes to their appearance and talk about their body parts as they age, rather than thinking of themselves in holistic terms as men do. Women will talk about, oh, my skin, or oh, my flabby arms, whereas men are more likely to talk about general functioning declining. Oh, I can't run as hard as I used to could. And they think more about their body in a holistic manner, which again reflects also that they're not objectifying themselves like women do. We also see from age 30 to age 85 a much higher percentage of women dissatisfied with age-related changes to their appearance. We see also, interestingly enough, that middle-aged people hold the most ageist attitudes, okay? And so what are some assumptions that you might make if you were ageist? Well, you might assume that older people have memory problems. You might assume that older people aren't worth your attention. You might assume that older people shouldn't be taken seriously. So those are all possible attitudes that you might have if you were ageist. Talking, let's see, about other ways that we see ageism. What if we see it cross-culturally? What are differences that might be there? Well, in our white American culture, we have a strong emphasis on individuality and materialism, and those values work best for the young and the strong, right? So those at midlife can usually cope fairly well with these high values or these values of individualism and materialism. But when people get older, they're bound to fail if they're judged on individualism, because as you age, you need more help. And this need for help is often seen as shameful in our culture. So we also see that what old age means, or what age is considered old, depends on culture. So in cultures that value interdependence and connection, so collectivistic cultures, the willingness to rely on others is not so different for older people than it is for younger ones. So again, that's in a more collectivistic culture. We'll see differences then between collectivistic cultures and individualistic cultures in terms of what it means to be old. Also, we'll see in some cultures when old people have meaningful roles, there's a less emphasis on their body and what they look like, and more on their contribution. For instance, in North American subcultures of African Americans and Native Americans, oftentimes older people are considered as wise elders who have meaningful roles contributing and passing on knowledge to younger members of the culture or of the group. So what do the changes mean in terms of our self-identity and our social identity? Well, like other forms of bias, ageism can be internalized and affect the individual's identity and self-esteem. So we talked about this already a little, but there's some additional research that I wanted to speak about here. The researchers Calasanti and Slevin in 2001 said that really that this is the heart of ageism. When we deny that we are aging and then we are forced to confront it, we treat it as ugly and tragic. So this is when we really see a discrepancy between our self-identity, our own subjective feeling of age, and our social identity, or the way our age looks to others. Okay, so this is where the ageism is internalized, specifically when you look at how you look in the mirror and you say, "Oh, I look so old," but I don't feel old. So you're not self-identifying as old, but your social identity, you feel that you look old to others, and so this discrepancy can be problematic for people. So there was a large study that was done in Sweden where they were looking at the discrepancy between that self-identity and that social identity. They found that every age group except the 20-year-olds reported a difference between their actual chronological age and their subjective age, the subjective age being that self-identity, how you feel and what age you feel you are. Most people said that they felt younger, wanted to be younger, and thought that others saw them younger than they actually were. So there was this disassociation from one's actual age. And unfortunately, this is the problem with this, is that essentially when you're disassociating from your age, that's disassociating from an important part of the self. It may keep you from bonding with other people your age, or it may keep your age group from acting collectively to change negative stereotypes about your age group. So this was an important study where they saw this discrepancy between self and social identities. So let's talk now about the next section of the chapter where we look at images of older women, and it will be no surprise to anybody that age stereotyping is triggered by appearance. So not necessarily by knowing someone's age, but the age stereotyping comes into play when you see what someone looks like. And this is why women in the U.S. will perpetually dye their hair, cover their gray, until they're in their 70s or their 80s even, right? Because of age stereotyping is so prevalent and so triggered by appearance in our culture. Invisibility, that's an important thing to talk about. That as women grow older, they become less visible in all forms of media, research has shown. So older men too are underrepresented, but not near as much as older women are underrepresented. And the most invisible aspect of older women is their sexuality. So older LGBTQ people have been invisible not only in the mainstream media, but even in media aimed at the gay community. Their sexuality becomes invisible, right? This is obviously contributes to the dysfunction that older women might experience, is this invisibility. If you think about the images and the stereotypes of older women, we definitely see that the stereotypes about the elderly or about elderly women, some stereotypes are positive and some are negative. The positive age stereotypes are related to warmth. These are stereotypes about women as grandmothers or women as doting elderly people, doting on the young. The negative stereotypes are related to competence, right? If you think about prototypes of older women in the media, we might see the mother-in-law, the older mother-in-law who's the mother-in-law from hell. Or we might see the manipulative, selfish elderly mother who is always demanding to get her way. Or we might see the comical but powerless little old lady who's always screeching and trying to get things done, but having a hard time. So these are some negative stereotypes. So what effects do we see from age stereotyping? Well, this can have a drastic effect on older people in terms of their medical care. Doctors may base their treatment decisions on their beliefs about how competent the older person is in terms of if they can take care of themselves, if they can comprehend what the doctor needs them to do. Okay? Oftentimes what happens is people will speak to older people in a way that assumes that they're incompetent. It's called Elderspeak. And this is using speech that's similar to baby talk. And it's speaking to the elderly as though they are small children. You might use a more lilting voice. Your grammar might be simplified. You might speak in a higher pitch. Results in older people feeling like they're being treated like children. They're being infantilized, right? This can be very patronizing and disrespectful to older people. And it tells them that you think that they're incompetent. So this can create self-fulfilling prophecies where they essentially become incompetent because they don't think that they know how to do things because of the way that you're treating them. They might act as if they're in poorer health than they even are when they're with doctors who treat them this way. So these can all be problems, and they're common issues that come from age stereotyping, this whole notion of elder speak. It's actually considered a form of ageism. So I'm going to stop there with my discussion of images of women in the media, and we'll pick up in our next lecture talking about physical changes in middle and later life, and that'll be the first part of lecture 2 on this chapter.